Welcome to the Election 2020 Teach-In. This event is part of a larger effort to bring our faculty and their expertise to bear on society's most pressing questions and challenges. We take seriously our responsibility to inform both students and broader audiences about issues that impact the public good, and I'm so excited to welcome our four faculty panelists this afternoon. Today, our focus is on the 2020 election, and we will cover many important topics such as the Electoral College, the role of media, and security and innovations in voting. So I will quickly introduce and welcome our faculty. They will each present in order, and then we will have time at the end for conversation across the panelists, questions from viewers, and from me. So while you're watching, please think of questions you might want to ask or things you'd like especially the group to talk about together, and you can ask those at the end. And also, I'll be monitoring the chat as well as we go. So I'm going to introduce all four faculty members, and then we'll begin. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Stephen Nawara from the Department of Political Science, Dr. Don Schneider, Department of Business Administration and Marketing, Dr. David Anderson from the Department of Communications, and Dr. Jason Perry, Department of Engineering, Computing, and Mathematical Sciences. Welcome to you all. And Professor Nawara, I think you are first up.
Hi, thank you for that introduction. So I am Professor Stephen Nawara. I'm an associate professor of political science here at Lewis, and I'm going to speak for a few minutes about how presidents are selected in the United States. It seems like it might be a fairly straightforward process, but like most things, it's not. It's significantly more complicated than that because we have this institution in the United States called the Electoral College that you've probably heard of. So we have the Electoral College. The popular vote, which is just the raw total of all the votes that are cast for each candidate in an election, doesn't actually determine who becomes the next president. Instead, that popular vote at the state level gets translated into the appointment of 538 electors that are sent by the state legislators to attend what's called the Electoral College. And it's actually these electors that select the president and the vice president in a meeting in mid-December. So what happens on November 3rd and in the early voting in the run-up to it is that when those results are tallied within each individual state, for 48 of the states, they will award all of their electors to the party that wins the overall statewide vote. There's a couple states, Maine and Nebraska, that award their electoral votes based on congressional district, but by and large, it's a winner-take-all contest within each of the 50 states. And to further complicate things, the number of electoral votes from each state is not uniform. It's determined by the size of a state's congressional delegation. So if you do the math, take 538 electors, that's the equivalent to the 100 senators that are in Congress plus 435 members of the House of Representatives, and then plus 3 electors for Washington, D.C., which the Constitution says is awarded the same number of electors as the smallest state. And so these electors are representatives of the party that wins the popular vote within a particular state. But just because someone's appointed to the Electoral College doesn't mean they actually have to vote the way that their state tells them to. Many states' laws forbid them from changing their votes, but nevertheless, there's nothing stopping them from going rogue and voting for somebody else. And this has happened, dozens and dozens of times throughout history. In the last presidential election, it was a little bit more controversial than the average election. There are actually 10 what we call faithless electors, people that voted for a candidate other than the one they were pledged to vote for. And in the past, this actually has affected elections. But way back in 1836, there was a tight race, and Martin Van Buren's vice president failed to get a majority of the Electoral College for vice presidency because of a faithless elector, and the Senate ended up having to select that person instead. And so the big takeaway that probably everybody knows, but just to be clear, that the popular vote doesn't necessarily equal the electoral vote. That we've had times throughout history where winners of the popular vote lose in the Electoral College. It's happened 5 times: John Quincy Adams, Rutherford Hayes, Benjamin Harrison, George W. Bush, and then Donald Trump. And I don't know, there's a phrase, there's a tweet for everything from Donald Trump. Donald Trump was actually tweeting about how bad of the Electoral College was. But of course, that was prior to when Donald Trump became president based on the Electoral College. Typically speaking, when there's a disconnect between the popular vote and the Electoral College, it's usually because the popular vote's relatively close, though that hasn't been the case in the more recent examples. George W. Bush lost by over 500,000 votes in the popular vote in 2000, but because the state of Florida went for him by 537 votes, he became the president. And then in the last election, Donald Trump actually lost the popular vote by, I think, 2.8 million votes once they counted everything. So there can be significant gaps between the popular vote and the Electoral College. And so you might ask, well, how does that happen? And that's because of the way we allocate congressional representation in the United States. Sparsely populated states have a greater influence on our electoral outcomes in the Electoral College and in Congress because they are automatically awarded at least 1 representative and at least 2 senators, regardless of their population. So even though the big prizes in the Electoral College are those large states like California, Texas, Florida, New York, Illinois even, I'd put in that category. It's true that those are big prizes because they do award a lot of electoral votes, but there's also a lot of very small states that gain a greater proportion of their influence in the Electoral College because they're guaranteed those 2 senators and that 1 representative. The graphic on the right shows that for every 712,000 people in California, there's 1 electoral vote. However, in Wyoming, there's 1 electoral vote for every 195,000 people. So there's a very large disparity between one individual's influence when it comes to selecting the president based on what state you live in. In theory, if you had a candidate eke by with bare majorities in each of the smallest states in the country, you could end up with a candidate winning the electoral vote with just like 22% of the vote, though that's obviously theoretical and wouldn't happen. Another factor to consider is that the Electoral College also does not grant any representation to U.S. citizens living in the territories. The territories include places like Puerto Rico, Marianas Islands, Guam, the Virgin Islands. We don't think about them in our politics very often, but there are 4.5 million people that live in the territories, which is a sizable chunk. That's actually more than the combined populations of Wyoming, Vermont, North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, and Delaware. So it's a large chunk of people that are not allowed to participate in presidential elections in this way. And the same was true for residents of Washington, D.C. until the Constitution was amended to allow Washington to receive those electoral votes. We can have situations where there are ties in the Electoral College or no majority is achieved in the Electoral College because more than 2 candidates are running. This has happened a couple times throughout history. 1800, there was a race between Jefferson and Burr. If you've heard Hamilton, you know all about it. It happened again in 1824. And when that happens, the race gets kicked over to the House of Representatives, where each delegation to the newly appointed House of Representatives, so whatever the results are in the election, they get together on a state-by-state basis and vote as a state delegation, with each state getting 1 vote. So it's not just based on a majority of the House. So again, in this example, the Republicans have a bit of an advantage because even though there's a pretty solid Democratic majority in the House of Representatives right now, the Republican Party actually controls 26 state delegations in the House. And then, oh, I accidentally zoomed instead of advanced, sorry. And so in terms of thinking about how this affects our current election, the best way to think about the Electoral College is to think of the states that are likely to be what are called the tipping point states. The idea here is that if you could array all of the states in order from their margin of victory, maybe the states most favorable to Trump to the states most favorable to Biden. The tipping point state would be the state that pushes a candidate over 270 electoral votes to get a majority. So in 2016, Pennsylvania was this tipping point state. It was the state that pushed Donald Trump over the top, if you will. And so even though Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 2.1 points, Donald Trump ended up winning Pennsylvania by a little bit less than a point. So when we figure it out, Donald Trump actually had a 2.8 percentage point majority. I shouldn't say majority, a 2.8 percentage point advantage in the Electoral College. In 2020, in this election, if you take current polling averages, Pennsylvania is still expected to be that tipping point state, though Donald Trump's perceived advantage in the Electoral College probably has actually grown a little bit since 2016. The gap between the national polling average and Pennsylvania polling averages is about 3.8 percentage points this time around. So there currently is kind of a bit of a built-in edge, a very clear built-in edge for the Republican Party in the Electoral College. And the question is whether or not that's going to continue to exist because the congressional delegation sizes are tied to population sizes of each individual state. And after each census, states gain and lose electoral votes and representation in the House of Representatives based on the census. So in 2024, if census projections are accurate, we're going to expect states like Florida and Texas and a handful of other states to pick up electoral votes, while another 10 states are expected to lose electoral votes. So even if this advantage for the Republican Party is kind of baked into the system right now, it doesn't necessarily mean it'll carry over for future elections, especially if Texas and Florida become a little bit more blue. So with that, I've kind of used up my 10 minutes. So I will turn it back over to Chris and he will introduce the next speaker. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And just a reminder, if you have a question while you're listening, please just write it down for yourself to ask later or type it into the Q&A section on the bottom right of our WebEx form here. So Dawn, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Dr. Dawn Schneider. I'm a marketing professor in the College of Business, and I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about the role of social media in our elections. Seems I think slides should show up at one point. I think they're uploading them. There we go. So before we talk about the current election, I need to go back a little bit and talk about some of our previous elections because they're basically the element of where we are today. And that goes all the way back. Looks like we don't have the movement on the slides. Okay. So it goes back all the way to the beginning in 2008. And this is the beginning of when we first see social media in our elections. So we have Barack Obama, obviously, as the candidate that won this election. And one of the reasons people believe that he won, right, was because of the social media involvement in this election. So he became the first candidate to use social media platforms in order to communicate with his voters. Social media was used for a variety of issues, but mostly to do things like solicit donations and organize volunteers. It was also used to raise awareness of issues and point out key issues. This use of social media for Obama actually gave him a little bit of a celebrity status, helped him connect with the voting population. What we see in the next election in 2012, so Obama versus Romney, was that Obama used the same tactics and he was against Mitt Romney, who at the core element only had a static website. So there wasn't a whole lot of evolution between these two cycles, but we did see an evolution in people, in us. With the first election here, we had about 42% of the American population online using social media. By the 2012 election, we had almost 60% of the population. So we're starting to move online and we're starting to use consumer data. So we see here that the Obama group, right, was matching voter records with online things like search history and then using that to target messaging. One of the other things we noticed was we started to see social media being used as a peer pressure tool within the election. The Obama group, again, administration, asked his Facebook followers to give access to their friends lists. 600,000 of them agreed. Through that, another 5 million contacts were achieved, and they were reached out and requested to give money to look at different kinds of campaign media and to vote. So this is the first time we saw social media using as a campaign platform, but it was also used to help predict the election and get out the vote. And the next one here. So then we see what we most listen to or think about now, the 2016 election. This is when social media became kind of legendary in terms of the election. At this point, we had more people getting their news online than radio or newspaper, and it starts approaching the level of television news, and television news continues to fall. When we look at Facebook alone during this campaign, we had 128 million people engaging online, but that translated to 8.8 billion likes, comments, posts, shares, right? So a lot of involvement. We also see the dominance start happening. So in the last couple of months of the election, Trump's campaign ran 5.9 million ads on Facebook. Clinton's campaign ran 66,000. So we start seeing some differences. We also see the Trump campaign starting to really micro-target political messages by using data that they had collected. And now we get to today, so Trump versus Biden, and what has shifted since 2016? Honestly, not a whole lot. We're still weaponizing data, so using micro-targeting, except we've gotten better at it. We can find the smallest, most minute details of a person's life and use that to accurately target campaign messaging. We see a lot of talk this time about misinformation and disinformation. Both existed last time, but what we're seeing again is the fact that the spread is so quick, we're unable to stop it. By the time it gets out there, it's a little too late. Trump still dominates in this environment. He dominates on social. He has more followers, more posts, more engagements, more shares, and more positive sentiment. So that's compared to Biden and any other candidate. The one thing that's slightly different this year is we see this kind of push or need or draw or interest in what we're calling viral moments. And that's these, GIFs or memes or videos that spread far and fast. The thing that's unique about them is they're often not campaign created. They're social media user campaign created. Any one of us can create one of these, and then they start to spread. So one of the things that people are thinking about now is if you're aware of it, the fly incident from the Pence debate. So a fly landed on Mike Pence, memes and puns were created, and that kind of information gets spread far and fast. So where we see we are today, right, is we've seen this shift in social media and this massive rise that social media has now become a political tool. It's changed a ton of relationships. It's changed the relationships between politicians and the press and the public and the politicians and us, and all three ways around. So we all have these different relationships because of the way that social media has played a part. And what is fundamentally different, right, is not necessarily that we have this difference in relationships, but it's talking a little bit more about where the news plays in. The news has always been something that tells us where to focus our attention, and this is no different today. So it primes the public. It tells us what we should understand, what our perspective should be, what's happening and what's going on. But we have a shift here in the medium and where we're getting our news from. We're getting our news today from social media, but the news has always shaped our agendas and our political information. But the way we access the news also shapes that. And we have this common saying, the medium is the message, meaning that the way you get your information or the way you get your news is often just as important as the news itself. The social media becomes forefront today because that's how we're communicating, but it doesn't change the fact that medium has always been the message when we talk about our political candidates. So if we can go all the way back to FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, he was well known for using fireside chats via radio to communicate with the public, and this is a way he kind of shared his charisma and talked to the people. JFK was the first president to really use television, and he used television to speak to the people. We saw Nixon actually using this kind of mentality too, but he went with small local public channels to communicate his message, and he did that primarily to avoid the Washington press corps. Local newscasters were kind of in awe to get to talk to a president, and they would throw him softball questions in turn. So he never really got hard-hitting questions because he talked to small local channels. We saw Reagan's comms team put him in front of these really patriotic scenes on television to deliver addresses. They also then shunned him and pulled him from dealing with the press. So he also never really dealt with the hard-hitting questions. And the Obama administration went straight to the people via social media, also at the same time avoiding dealing with journalists. So we've also found throughout time, right, that the way we communicate is part of the message. So which brings us to today, right? And social media becomes a huge part of our news diets of a large percentage of the population. In fact, 56% today of our US population either sometimes or often get their news from social media. Why is this so important? Well, some of my slides are getting altered by this format. Hopefully this works here. Social media's whole purpose is to amplify information, and they use a variety of different algorithms. Each platform's a little bit different. Facebook has one, Twitter has one. They amplify two different kinds of information. One is paid advertising. So if you pay to put something on there, that social media platform will automatically amplify that for you. The other thing we have is native content, meaning what I tweet or what I post on any of these platforms can be amplified. But how does a platform determine what to amplify? They amplify based on what's engaging. And what becomes engaging is the question. What is engaging are a couple of different things. One of the things we find to be really engaging are things that actually attract our attention. We hear the term something like clickbait. See a really interesting article, the title grabs you, you click it. That may or may not be what you see after that, but the title is what draws us in. The titles that draw us in are things that confirm to our pre-existing biases, things we already believe or already expect to be true. That's what we're going to click on. If we talk about how that spreads, right, 6 in 10 of us will share an article without ever reading it based on the article title itself. Every single one of us has done this at one point or another. The other thing that we see that really gets amplified is this concept we hear about a lot today, fake news, the idea of fake news. Fake news is not new. We've always had misinformation and disinformation. What is new today with social media is the amplification or spread of this fake news. So again, we talk about what gets spread, right? What gets shared. As humans, we're not really good at identifying true and false. We can't tell when someone's lying or telling the truth. We can't tell based on an article whether or not it's true or false, but we can tell if it's consistent with our view. So what we often see is, right, sharing of disinformation or misinformation is not a goal or intent to spread lies or spread mistruths, but instead it's a goal for us to share what we believe in and what we value. And we go often based on things like headlines. Now, what again is going to attract us is often something that attracts or brings in strong emotions. And what kind of emotions are strong? Things that are usually strong with us, we find the fact that anger, right, elicits more reaction than joy. We find that things that are really novel and new, things that are interesting are more likely to solicit emotion from us. Things that are interesting are often things that tend to be false, because it's much more interesting to see something about, you know, a person with 8 legs than the fact that a grandma baked cookies today. So we're going to see things that look really interesting, and we're going to spread things based on the elicitation of this response from us. So how, again, does this move through social media? Well, when we see something that looks interesting to us, that confirms what we believe, right, within our feed, we then usually share that. I agree with this, I'm going to share this. And then people within our networks will then receive that content. They then will see this content and share that again with their own groups, right? And we kind of keep seeing this movement. Well, because we share things that we already agree with, we have this bias already towards that. And by sharing it through our networks, who then share that again, we're amplifying this bias. But again, why would that work? Why would people in our network share a bias or share the same information. And we go back to who's in our network and what's in our network. And we connect with people online, right, that are like us. This is the whole point and benefit of social media. And that's what makes it so amazing. I've got groups of people that have similar interests to me, and I follow different groups, local groups, national groups. I've got a group of other faculty members that I engage with, and I've got a group of dog lovers that I engage with, right? And so we find people like us online and we interact with them. And we start to create these little bubbles of people with the same opinions. And what that ends up doing is also creating what we call an echo chamber, meaning everybody that we bubble with has the same feelings as us. And so we continue to share the same feelings with a small subset of people. And that makes us feel like our feelings and our opinions are always correct because everybody that we share them with agrees with us. But how does that happen? So how do we end up with a whole bunch of people that we talk to online all agreeing with us? Well, what happens if someone doesn't agree? If someone doesn't agree with us, especially in today's environment, we block them or we mute them or we stop talking to them. And what we found is 39% of users recently have admitted to blocking or stopping to talk with someone based on political content. So you are a Democrat, you block all of your friends that are supporting Trump, and opposite. So now you continue to have this network that only shares like-minded thoughts. So all of that technically is the bad news, right? So social media creates these small bubbles where we only talk to people that we like. We only share things that usually rile us up, that anger us. We're more likely to share bad news than good news. We're more likely to share fake news than good news. And we kind of continue to amplify these things throughout social media. But it isn't all bad. There have been a ton of positive impacts regards to social media when it comes to the political world. Some of those, for example, we talk about the fact that more and more people can be politically engaged. Anybody can be online and find information about candidates. We can talk to other people about their ideas and their views. Voters have created positive feelings about the candidates and feel like they actually have personal relationships with candidates on local and national levels. We've also seen our elected officials become more accountable. Voters directly ask them questions. We've seen candidates change their platforms because of voter response, right? Changing their stance and their opinions. We've also seen disinterested citizens, people we previously couldn't engage, become engaged because we can pull out and reach that far, going through networks. We've had more and more people engaging in online social political discussions. We've had persecuted minorities, people who previously didn't vote, minors who couldn't vote before but came of age in this election, become advocates over the past couple of years. So social media's pulled them in. We've also seen social media pull across different movements like the Me Too movement. We've seen them arrange and organize political protests. This year, we've actually had record-breaking voter registration. All of that has been attributed to our current social media status. So then one of the things we're hearing a lot this year is that whether or not somebody wins this election will be 100% based on social media, right? That social media will alter the election. Many people believe that social media, actually specifically Facebook, was responsible for altering the outcome in 2016. And there are, many who believe in this question and in this concept. And one of the things that's most important to note, right, is that there is this impact of where we get our news and what's disseminated and fake news and real news and misinformation and disinformation, and it all exists. But social media likes, right, and Facebook likes and your tweets and the information that you see online, those things are not actually what creates the outcome of our elections. Right? What really creates the outcome is votes. So what we need to figure out is how we interpret the information we see online and where that leads us to actually acting at the ballot box. That's my spiel, and back to Chris for our next presenter.
Thank you so much, Dawn, for that really thought-provoking presentation. I can't wait to the question period to ask you some questions. So David, take it away. Your turn.
All right. Hi, I'm David Anderson. And I'm going to be talking about media and the news media in particular. And I'm also waiting for the PowerPoint slides. There we go. Okay, there's always been a adversary relationship between the press and the media. Thomas Jefferson telling us about fake news back in 1807, and not much really has changed since then. The media, there's a variety of sources that you can use: print, broadcast, political commercials, debates, websites, social media. And in using any of those, I'm mainly interested in your just knowing the basic information literacy and media literacy dimensions of commercials and news. And so when you're looking at any medium, you always have to ask yourself questions about bias and spin. As Dr. Schneider went through, social media has always been used to try and influence your perceptions and influence the way that you interpret events. Well, in this case, all of the media tend to have a bias, very explicit, sometimes implicit, and they always try and spin information to their advantage. The media is also very effective in setting agendas, getting you to think about certain topics, and you have to be aware of what's truthful, what's not truthful, what's fake news, and so forth. So starting first with print, always be aware that there's a political orientation to the media. The Washington Post leans more than leans left, and the Wall Street Journal more than leans to the right. There's a difference, though, between news and opinion. The Post and the Journal both do a fairly good job in terms of reporting the news of the day, but they have very strong opinions that they'll communicate to their readers. The newspapers also endorse candidates, and based on the orientation of the publication, you can get a feel for if they're going for Trump or Biden, or if they're for or against the new tax proposal, and so forth. One of the things that I'd encourage you to do with only 2 weeks to go before the election is most newspapers, major newspapers, have voter guides. And these voter guides are very useful. I know that Dr. Nawara's class put together a voter's guide for the presidential candidates, and those are very, very useful, and you should take a look at those. And the Tribune will obviously have it for all of the races in the Chicagoland area, so will the Sun-Times. All right, broadcast media has kind of gone off the rails in recent years. Both in terms of news and commercials. In terms of cable news, they've moved from having objectivity, fairness, and balance as their main concerns, and really becoming much more of the partisan press. So the broadcast media of today looks really much like the media of 1776. They have a particular team, and MSNBC is on the Democratic team, Fox News, obviously, on the Republican team. Some networks, and that's okay, as long as you know what team they're on, it helps you interpret the news. The problem becomes is when you have a station like CNN, which claims to be neutral, but in fact tends to strongly side with one particular team. I've given you a link. It's a media bias chart. What it does is it looks at all of the media on a scale in terms of their news, their opinion, their dedication to facts, and so forth. And it puts each media outlet on this chart. So you can look at something like Breitbart and see where they fall on the media bias scale. You could look at Fox News and see where they fall. You could look at Atlantic, New Yorker, and so forth. And it's a good way of just checking where the media are and where their blind spots might be. In terms of broadcasting, we have a couple of other issues to deal with. We have the opinion shows like Meet the Press, Face the Nation, and so forth. And you have to ask yourself who represents the various positions. CBS, NBC tends to get a variety of people on their panels. CNN tends to have the same 7, 8 people representing every particular issue that they talk about. You really want to know what the background of the respondents are and of the host. So, for example, George Stephanopoulos was the PR director for, Bill Clinton. And so to bring him out as this objective source stretches credibility. But all of the hosts of these shows tend to have some background in politics, and it gives them credibility and it gives them expertise, but it also tends to influence the way that they look at positions. Okay, we also have political debates, and you've seen this year they haven't been too successful. Historically, they were always a way of pitting the candidates against one another and framing issues. They were really never that good in terms of articulating the issues. They were really meant to give you a sense of the character of the person and how they held up under the stress of the situation. Political town halls, sometimes these are useful in terms of giving you in-depth information, and you're able to follow up on questions, but it depends how they're handled. So last week we had a good case study of that. In one case, we had Joe Biden doing a town hall, but he was basically interviewed by a friendly source who tended to lob softball questions to him. And then on the other channel, we had Donald Trump, who tended to be involved in a more adversarial kind of situation. Both of them provided you with interesting information, but in terms of a means of becoming politically informed, probably not the best. Also, in terms of broadcasting, we have political commercials. And really, this is probably the absolute worst form of political communication you can have. They are purely emotional, and they make the person look as bad as humanly possible. So if the goal is to really dislike and despise another person, watch a lot of political commercials. You're really not going to become informed on the issues, but you certainly get your emotional level hyped up. All right, web pages, as Dr. Schneider noted, and social media are the media of today. Web pages are, everywhere. And even though web and the social media are the primary source of news and information, most of that information still comes from traditional journalistic sources, AP, the New York Times, Washington Post, and so forth. However, there's a variety of sites you can get your political information from, some really good, some very partisan. You really have to shift through and find which ones are appropriate. You also have the candidates' web pages, which are actually good. Just always be aware that you're just getting the candidate's best side. It's like asking their mother what they think about the candidate, okay? You're only going to get positive information, but at least you're going to know what their issues are. Okay, Dr. Schneider talked about social media. All I want you to be left with out of social media is just be aware that it's so easy to be part of an information bubble. It's so easy just to find information that already agrees with you. And you have to force yourself to find, both sides or all sides of an issue. Okay, we also have the problem right now with social media of censorship. And we currently have a battle between the two parties over censoring certain information on the sites and allowing certain information on the sites and shutting down people on the sites. And this is going to go on for a while, but it's an issue of tremendous concern. So just be aware that, this is going on. Okay, other considerations of the media is the media is really good on big races. Okay, all of you are tremendously informed by now of the presidential candidates. When governors run, you're tremendously informed because the media covers those races extensively. However, I suspect that most of you don't have a clue about your representatives, the judges, and the trustees, because local media does a terrible job covering local political races. The Chicago media doesn't cover who's running in Bolingbrook, who's running in Romeoville, what's happening in Lisle. They focus just on the big ticket races and really don't focus on the local races. You have to find that out for yourself. And the media tends to focus on process, not issues, okay? And by that I mean, they'll cover a story and say, yesterday Joe Biden talked about Social Security. They don't tell you what he said about Social Security. They tell you that he talked about Social Security. And that's a problem. For example, last week, as Dr. Schneider noted, the big outcome of the vice presidential debate was the fly on Pence's head. They didn't inform us about what they said, but they did inform us about the fly. Okay, two things I want you to be left with, though. In order to effectively use the media and social media, be an active voter, not a passive voter. If you just sit on your chair and watch political commercials and watch TV news, you're going to be a very, very uninformed voter. You need to be active and actually seek out the candidates' positions on issues and find the best unbiased information sources that you can. So be an active information seeker, not a passive. And before you even start this whole process, know what you believe and where you stand on the issues so that you can compare yourself to what the candidates are saying. The candidates are very, very good at persuasion. And if I sat you down with Joe Biden, he would convince you that, yeah, these are what you should believe. And you'll say, sure, I believe you. And then I'll bring in someone else and they'll talk to you and you'll say, yeah, sure, that sounds reasonable. Well, you should start knowing what you believe and where you stand before you start evaluating all of the other information. All right, I'll turn it now over to Jason.
Yeah, thank you, David. And Dr. Jason Perry, please take over.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jason Perry. I teach in the Engineering, Computer, and Mathematical Sciences department, and I teach a lot of courses about computer security. So that informs what I'm going to talk about today. Of course, technology is impacting every aspect of our lives, and I want to talk about how the increasing use of technology brings potential and also problems and security issues with elections, and just to sort of make us aware of where that might go. Okay, so the thing that we seem to be moving all toward is e-voting, right? Voting electronically. Parts of the voting process are already electronic, but why should we even, some people would ask, try to move toward a more electronic voting process? Well, there are some good reasons to try to do that. Okay, technology does make our lives easier in some way. It holds the promise of, getting the results of elections faster, making it easier for people to vote so that more people can participate in that democratic process. As I say here, being able to vote or making it convenient for people to vote is not just a luxury issue, right? It's essential to democracy that everybody is able to access the vote. But of course, none of that should be done at the cost of security. We absolutely depend on the process being as secure as possible when we run our elections. So I like to tell my students to put on their security hat and think like a security person. What security people really try to do is they look at a situation and they analyze it and say, well, what should happen in this situation? What things do we want to preserve, like confidentiality or integrity of data or availability of services? And then what would constitute an attack on that? What should not happen? And so to give a real simple analysis of an election scenario, right? In an election, what should happen? Well, each citizen should have exactly one vote on the ballot within their precinct and nowhere else. The vote should be private, and we should count the votes quickly and accurately. Okay. What should not happen? in an election? Well, obviously, nobody should be able to change somebody else's vote. Nobody should be able to forge or make up votes or delete, get rid of votes, prevent people from voting, modify the count in any way, or even to unnecessarily delay or bog down that process. Those are negative outcomes. So when you look at what you want to happen and don't want to happen in an election, the requirements are really the same regardless for whether it's an electronic or non-electronic elections. They start from the same goal. But the big difference is how, right? How the requirements of that election could be violated and what we have to do in the realm of technology to try to prevent those requirements from being violated. Of course, technology is already a part of our election process, but it's not gone as far as it might. So you can think of progressive steps in terms of integrating technology into the election procedure. In Illinois, what most of us have now is simply paper ballots, regardless of whether we mail those in or go to the polling station. It's a paper ballot. However, the paper ballot is scanned by an electronic machine and tabulated electronically, and from that point on, the election is electronic. Some places have electronic voting machines already where there is no paper. You simply press a button on the machine, and then the tabulation goes from there. But I think what we all think of when we think about e-voting is, of course, the end goal, which is app voting, right? You download an app on your phone, and it's you register on the phone, and you vote on your app, and you press the button, and that's how you vote. Okay, is this a good idea? I think it's something we're going to move toward inevitably. Of course, I don't think anybody should be shut out of an election, so you want to have as many ways as reasonable to make the vote accessible to as many people. Of course, still, not everybody has access to technology or is fluent with technology. So ideally, you have these multiple options all integrated in a compatible way. But what we'll be talking about mostly from here on out is this scenario where we consider a fully electronic, even app on your own device, so you don't even have to go to a polling station type of voting. Okay, so it's a very simple, high-level overview of what would happen in such an e-voting scenario, so you can start to think about the security issues. Here's the person with their app, right? They click what they want to vote on, and your phone is connected to the internet, whether it be across the cellular network or Wi-Fi. And the internet is what's used to transmit your vote to, say, the precinct or the county servers, computers that will tabulate the votes locally. And then those totals will be forwarded on to, at the state or even the national level, other computers that will assemble the final count of all the votes. Okay, so where could things go wrong in this, right? Where could hackers come in and do something we don't want them to do? Well, the short answer is everywhere in this process, but it's not the same level of threat or urgency for all of them. Okay. So let's think about, I had this slide building out step by step originally, but it's okay. Let's think about where an attacker could target in this process and how we could even defend against them. So the first category would be attacks, at the app level. One thing that does seem a little bit dangerous about e-voting on people's phones is that you have very little control over what people have on their phones, whether it be malware or who knows what kind of software running on that phone that the voting app is also running on. You could easily imagine some malware gets installed on a person's phone along with the voting app, and that malware will try to detect and modify or block the activity of the voting app. Real security threat there. A possible way to defend against that is really to take advantage of what's already available to us in our phones, which is the isolation that our phone's operating systems make possible between one app and another app. If that's working really well, then the scenario I described should not be that possible. Okay. I think the main category of attack that people think about when they think about hacking elections is attacks on these servers, on these machines that count the votes. And yeah, there is a wider variety of things that could go wrong with that. The machines themselves, you don't know who might have access to them. They could install corrupted versions of the vote counting software that could modify that. Of course, you could have people in another nation, on the other side of the globe entirely trying to remotely hack into those servers and change things. Something that can also be done, we call a denial of service attack. You can simply try to bombard these machines with so much traffic that they go down. We've all experienced that with websites going down or because of a bad connection. So that's one type of attack that could have a real negative outcome on an election. So defenses against that would include, having a real auditing process where you make sure you know exactly which software is installed on these voting machines and vote count machines, and have that whole process audited and so the software can be trusted. You might not think of it, but even securing the physical access to the machine themselves. Make sure no person could physically get in the presence of that machine. We usually think of hacking as something remotely, but if the wrong person gets in the room with one of these machines, in fact, it's a lot easier for them to do a lot more damage than even they could remotely. So physical access is an important part of computer security. And finally, you might just want to minimize the access or exposure that these machines have on the internet overall, because, of course, the less a machine is exposed on the internet, the harder it is to hack. You may not want to have, your most secure voting machines on the internet at all. It's the safest way, although they need to transmit data to each other. So it's hard to completely cut even an election machine that needs to be highly secure, to cut that off from the internet. The third category of attacks would be attacks on the network. Okay, you might think, oh, the vote is going to be very vulnerable when it's flying between one machine and the next on the internet. But in fact, because of the magic of encryption, that may be one of the easiest things to secure about an electronic election, because we have really good encryption and authentication algorithms, we call them, to make sure that nobody can decrypt that traffic or read it who doesn't need to, or change it. Okay, but it is important to have a trusted implementation of that. Okay. I don't have a lot of time for this, but I do want to point out, I call them cryptographic superpowers. A lot of the ability to secure things that encryption algorithms give us on computers. They're really powerful tools. So cryptography allows us to do a lot of the very things that we want to have in a secure election. For instance, assigning a unique and unforgeable ID to each registered voter as a way of ensuring that each person gets exactly one vote. Okay, encryption can make sure that the integrity as well as the privacy of the vote are ensured while it's being transmitted, and also allow the receiver to verify the identity of the sender to make sure that it's a legitimate message. And we can do all this with encryption while still making it very difficult to trace the value of a vote back to a voter. So we could even do this while keeping the process anonymous. That's why I call them cryptographic superpowers. Okay, but they don't work for us automatically. Okay, there's still a trust base that you need to establish for any system. Right? We only get security from these algorithms in the real world if we can be assured that they've been implemented correctly and securely, and if the machines that are doing these cryptographic computations are not compromised or hacked into. Okay, so it's not a silver bullet. It gives us ability to sort of narrow down what we need to trust, but we still need trust. We still need oversight, even in the electronic world, to run a secure election. So to wrap up, my conclusions would be, don't be afraid, I would say, of electronic elections or e-voting. Okay, there's potential there to make them just as secure, if not more secure, than paper voting in elections. But it doesn't happen automatically, and it won't happen overnight, as we saw in the case of the sort of botched electronic primary in Iowa back in the spring. There's this power that encryption gives us, but it has to be used correctly. Definitely, there should be auditing, there should be oversight. I'm a strong proponent of making software for something as important as this open source. And what that means is that experts can inspect the source code of that software and verify that it's not doing anything sneaky with the vote data. Okay. And so there does need to be, as always, oversight. Oversight is important for paper and in-person elections. It's going to continue to be important for electronic elections. But more for electronic elections, it needs to be the case that the people who are doing the oversight have technical expertise to be able to tell, is anything funny going on with these voting machines. For now, a lot of the experts in security are still recommending, yes, you can have an electronic election, but you should back it up with a paper-based audit trail so you can have all the documentation in case something goes wrong with that. All right, that's all I've got. Thanks for your attention.
Jason, thank you so much. It's fascinating. So thank you to all of the panelists. We now have time for questions. So let me remind you that you have many choices around asking questions. We seem to have a chat and a Q&A feature in our WebEx thing here. So please feel free to use that. Or I believe there's a hand raising function, and I think there's few enough of us here together live right now that we could probably just call out as well. So while people are deciding what choice they're going to use to ask questions, I might start with a couple. And really, Jason, I want to ask you one question specifically before moving to some questions for the whole panel, which is that it's so interesting to think about the future and the prospect of online voting and the security issues that come up with that. I wonder if you could distinguish a little bit between what the digital demands are for the current election, and what is the kind of cybersecurity approach to managing that election, if you can think about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. A lot has changed actually since the spring because of COVID. It seems to sort of frozen a lot of the directions we were going in, because we were thinking about rolling out, electronic elections. Some states were trying it for the primaries. And now we've kind of gone back to saying, well, okay, get a paper ballot and mail it in. So because everything's been on hold. But I think, the security needs to be built in, to each step. I don't think we can go all at once from fully paper to fully electronic. So those steps I mentioned sort of are how the security person would think through and say, okay, well, we need encryption to secure this. We need to audit the software to have this sort of voting machine. And that's progress, I think, would be toward that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you so much. I see we have a hand up from Jay Tatum. So if you could just unmic yourself and ask the question. Oh, we heard you for a second.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I had a question specifically in regard to, I guess, the e-voting. Do you ever see it developing a pathway to have like at-home proctored virtual voting? I guess to kind of improve turnout among, say, disabled people who might not be able to get to polling places easier, or just people who might not have the time during regular voting hours. They could take a quick 5-10 minutes at home to do an online proctored one.
That's a great question, and I think that would be one of the technology alternatives that we absolutely should look into in order to support everybody. I think you sound like you might have even taken an online proctored exam, right? And you've seen how that monitoring function can work. And I believe that's something that could be made to work for the voting process also. And if it enables greater accessibility of the vote, I'm all for that.
Thank you. So here's a question for the panel. Especially listening to Jason, I find it interesting, even though we're 14 days away or 13 days away from an election, to be thinking about the longer term future. So I'm just curious what everyone else thinks will be changing in the election of 2028, 2034. How will media be different? How will the electoral college still exist, and so on? I wonder if we could just back away a little bit from what we're obsessing over and think about that longer term future. How is voting evolving?
I guess I can jump in on the electoral college. the Electoral College is not a popular institution in this country. Yeah, I think something like 55, 60% of people say they want to get rid of it. The problem with doing that, however, is that it's in the Constitution. So doing so would probably mean getting a constitutional amendment to abolish it. And that's really unlikely to happen. For the main reason that I sort of hit on in my slides a little bit is that the Electoral College advantages smaller states. In order to pass an amendment to the Constitution, 3/4 of the states have to ratify any changes. So there's enough small states that benefit from having the Electoral College that I don't see them ever voting to abolish it. What's more likely, but still probably not a plurality outcome by any stretch, is that there is a movement that's being pushed called the National Popular Vote Compact, or I think it's called the Interstate Popular Vote Compact. It's basically an agreement between various states to award their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. And I think many states have joined on to this. I think they're up to 198 electoral votes that have signed on to this. And it would only go into effect once 270 electoral votes are a part of this compact. And so that would be kind of like an end around the Electoral College. The Electoral College still wouldn't be abolished. It would still function. It would just be that each state would send their votes to, or their electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote. But even that's somewhat far-fetched because it would probably face numerous court challenges, not to mention any individual state could pull out of that agreement. You know, if Donald Trump wins the national popular vote, I don't know if Illinois, heavily Democratic Illinois would send their electoral votes to Donald Trump, for instance. So I think we're kind of stuck with it for a while.
David, Don, thoughts about the long-term future?
The one thing that I'll say, and I think it was the point I was kind of taking, is, there's so much discussion right now about social media and its influence, but media has always had an influence. So I don't see that changing. Will 2024, 2028, will Facebook influence the election? Probably not. The belief in Facebook keeps changing. The questions in Twitter and whether or not they can manage bots and security, they can't. None of them can do that. So I think the platforms will change, but the media will always have a role in influencing our ideas and our thoughts and, shaping that perspective. And I think ideally, as a wish, I would hope as people, we learn to take things a little bit more seriously and not just share something without reading it. And just because it confirms what we believe, if it looks too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true. And I think in this election, we're a little swept up in that, but I hope in 4 years from now, we say, hey, you know what? This ticks all my boxes. It looks too good to be true. I'm just going to verify it. Then I'll decide if I believe it. So I hope that people kind of change, but the media still will have the same role.
Yeah, I would say that there seem to be a lot of problems with the media right now in terms of covering local elections. And we also have bias on the national side. And over the next couple of years, democracy requires an informed electorate. And right now, we're not an informed electorate. As bad as, newspapers and broadcasting can be sometimes, they still have editors and they still, remove and check things. But social media doesn't have editors. Anyone can just get on and say whatever. You get all of these anonymous kinds of information that are placed out there. And on the local level, on the Lisle, Naperville, Downers Grove level, we need an information source that provides citizens with accurate information in terms of voting. And so I think we're going to see changes in 24 and 28 to try and get some nonpartisan objective information to voters through the media.
Thank you. David, I might want to stay with you for I have a couple of naive questions I'm going to ask. In case other people are waiting to ask questions, please do so now. I'm going to start asking my naive questions that are sincere, but may sound insincere. My first one is, why are media biased? I appreciate that you said they went back, it goes back to 1776, and obviously in other countries back further than that. What is their motivation for bias?
Mainly because the ownership of the media changed their view of news from being a public service that they did to inform the citizens to being entertainment and being a profit center for the company. And the traditional broadcast stations, 257, NBC, ABC, CBS, stayed pretty committed to being objective for a while. But when cable came along and Fox News was so successful, basically supporting a Republican conservative worldview, MSNBC and CNN kind of went along with that. And it proved to be very, very profitable for them. And it was mainly done for economic reasons, and the viewers followed. But we see that the public is really not being served well by that kind of partisan media.
Don, do you want to add anything to that from a social media perspective?
So I think, if you go from platforms, the platforms have bias also. And I think hopefully that will change because we're seeing Twitter, especially recently, has done a lot more action. I think there's a lot more demands for the platforms to become more neutral, censor everyone or don't censor anyone, or you can't only censor one side, or however that works. I think that discourse is going to continue over the next 4 years. And I think we'll see more neutrality in the platform. But the people on the platforms are always going to have bias, and that's just a human element. And you can become popular, on any one of these platforms. The largest followers are often ghost accounts, so you can become popular without actually being even technically a real person. And what makes you popular is your bias. If I go on there every day and I tweet neutral things like, I think asparagus is okay, Joe Biden seems like a nice guy, Trump's suit is nice today, nobody's going to look at my stuff. So instead, the more outrageous we are, the more we push that level, the more people are interested in what we want to say. And again, I think that's never going to go away. Sensationalism sells.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's fascinating. So we're running up against our time. I may have one more question for each of you to answer in any way that you want to. Many of you have already answered it in your presentations, but I just want to maybe ask again or draw it out a little bit. And that question is, why do we vote in the first place? And maybe if you could reflect a little bit about that, like you've clearly of all deeply assumed that it's vitally important to democracy is something that David said. And so if there's anything you want to kind of add to that or peel back that onion a little bit more in terms of what the purpose of voting is, or if you want to make any other final comments before we close, this would be a great time. So maybe Steve, we can start over with you. Yeah,
sure. So our system of government is not an autocracy. We don't have policy being made by individuals based on might making right or anything like that. Instead, we elect officials to represent us and to represent our will. So at the root level, the act of voting is having an input into the politicians that are going to make decisions that affect your life. And one thing, I'll say that since I talked about the Electoral College, is that one thing that I run into in my classes a lot is that students will use the Electoral College as an excuse not to vote, as if the popular vote doesn't matter at all. That's not the case, right? The national popular vote doesn't select the president, but individuals, state popular votes do, aggregated together. But even beyond that, the act of voting for president, you are going to be one vote out of probably 130 million people voting, if not more. So it will be, a drop in the bucket, if you will. But at lower levels of government, the races are much, much closer and have a much deeper impact on your day-to-day life. I live in an unincorporated area of Plainfield. And the number of people that voted in my township elections, for example, is very, very small. And yet I rely on those township supervisors to plow my streets and pick up my leaves and things like that. A very tangible way affects my life that many presidents don't. So I don't want to focus too much just on the presidency. That it has impacts at the local level as well.
Thank you so much, Steve. Don, any last thoughts?
I think when you go back to this idea of bias, right, and we all have biases, and some of them are good and bad. Sometimes we need more information and we maybe should enlighten ourselves, but we have certain reasons we believe in certain things. You can go all the way down to something as simple as, I believe the people on my street drive too fast, right, and I wish they would put in a speed bump. And some other people will say speed bumps destroy cars and they ruin traffic and bikes fall over. And so you have two sides of every single argument. And the point of having bias is it's a belief that you have, and we use voting to be able to state those beliefs. Otherwise, you're just talking. You can talk all day about speed bumps, right? But if you want a speed bump on your street, you need to find a local official that's going to support that and channel your money in the right places and make your voice heard. So the vote is the ability to actually create action. You can tweet and post and rant and rage all you want, but your vote helps channel that change. So in order to have your biases mean something, then the voting is what creates that outcome.
Yeah, thank you. David, last comments?
Yeah, I agree with what's been said. I certainly can understand the frustration of a lot of people. I mean, when you look at our political system and you see our gerrymandered districts, you see the money that's involved in the process. You see that some huge number of races, I think almost 50% in Illinois, are unopposed. It's easy to get frustrated with the system. And I think I can predict fairly accurately that Biden will win Illinois, okay? And so you say, well, why does my vote matter? And like Steve said, there's a lot more on the ballot besides the presidential race. All the local races, all the local referendums, all have a much more direct and immediate impact on your life. And it's really the only way to bring about peaceful social change, because there really aren't other alternatives.
Thank you so much. Jason, final comment?
Yeah, I think others have said better than I could why the vote is important. So I would add to that is that, the vote needs to be made available to every American, not just in theory, but in practice. And to me, that includes keeping up with changes in technology and the way people interact. And, the problem of how to run a secure election is something that you can't just solve once and set aside. It has to sort of, in a sense, keep being resolved and revisited as things change.
Wow, thank you so much, all four of you. That has given us so much to think about, and we've learned so much from listening to your presentations, as well as your extremely informed and thoughtful comments in these last few minutes. So again, thank you so much for your contributions today to Lewis in general and to our community. It's been really high quality information, and I appreciate it so much. Thank you everyone who's with us today and who's watching later. So I hope you appreciated it. I hope you enjoyed it and appreciated the information, and thanks so much for being here for these last 90 minutes or so. Everyone have a great afternoon, and go vote. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.